When I discovered 120 houses built on my property, I didn't call the police. I called my lawyer and launched what would become the most expensive game of chess this HOA had ever faced. Imagine coming home after working overseas for 2 years and finding an entire neighborhood where your grandmother's cornfield used to be. Street signs like Magnolia Lane and Dogwood Drive. Kids riding bikes on driveways poured over land that had been in my family for 80 years. A clubhouse with a pool sat right where Babsia used to grow her prize-winning tomatoes. The HOA president laughed in my face when I showed her my deed, called me a scammer, and even threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property. By the end of this, I planned to own their HOA, their management company, and, if I played my cards right, even their children's college funds. What would you do if you found an entire neighborhood on your property? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this HOA nightmare stretches. My name's Thaddeus Kowalski. Friends call me Thad. I'm a third-generation Polish-American who spent the last 15 years working oil rigs, from the North Sea to the Gulf of Mexico. Tough work, good money, but it kept me away from home for months at a time. Home, in my case, is 40 acres of Georgia clay that my grandmother, Bobia, left me when she passed. Babsia Kowalski was tougher than a $2 steak and twice as salty. She bought that land in 1943 with money she saved cleaning rich folks' houses, 40 acres of red dirt, pine trees, and the sweetest well water you could ever taste. The old farmhouse sat on a hill overlooking fields where she grew enough vegetables to feed half the county during the Depression. When she died 5 years ago, I inherited everything: the house, the barn, the timber rights, and every square inch of that beautiful, seemingly worthless land. I kept paying the property taxes from whatever rig I was on, figuring I'd retire there someday, fix up the old place, maybe raise some cattle. 2 weeks ago, the smell of diesel fuel and salt spray still clinging to my clothes, I drove up that gravel driveway, and what I found made my blood pressure spike higher than a Christmas tree. Magnolia Estates. 120 cookie-cutter houses with perfect lawns, a clubhouse that looked more like a country club, and a swimming pool where Babsha's chicken coop used to stand. Street signs, fire hydrants, mailboxes with little decorative flags. The works. I sat in my pickup truck for 20 minutes, just staring. The sound of children laughing in what used to be our family cemetery. The crunch of fresh gravel under bicycle tires. Even the air smelled different, chlorine from pool chemicals mixing with the artificial scent of fresh mulch. That's when I met Vivian Blackwood. Picture every HOA nightmare you've ever heard. Wrap it in a white BMW and perfectly highlighted hair, give it a law degree, and a husband on the county commission. Vivian was standing in my front yard, my land, directing a landscaping crew with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire privileged life. I approached her with my survey documents and property deed, the politest Sunday church tone I could muster. I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is my land. She looked me up and down as if I were a piece of gum stuck to her shoe. Work boots, faded jeans, the kind of tan you earn under honest labor beneath foreign suns. Honey, she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness, this is a respectable neighborhood. Whatever scam you're running won't work here. I handed her the deed. I watched her expression shift from condescending to confused to white as fresh paint. This has to be fake, she stammered. That deed has been in my family since 1943. Your clubhouse is sitting on my grandmother's grave. She slammed the door so hard the decorative wreath fell. Through the window, I could see her on the phone, gesturing wildly, probably calling her husband Bradley, the county commissioner who somehow managed to approve a 120-home development on land he didn't own. The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth as I walked back to my truck. These people had built their American dream on my family's legacy, assuming a working man wouldn't have the resources to fight back. They were about to learn that 15 years on oil rigs teaches you more than just how to work with your hands. When you're dealing with international maritime law, billion-dollar contracts, and lawyers from 12 different countries, you pick up a few things about how the world really works. That night, I slept in my truck outside the old farmhouse, now the centerpiece of Vivian's fancy neighborhood, and began planning the most expensive chess game these people had ever played. Within 48 hours, Vivian Blackwood declared war. She filed a restraining order, claiming I was unstable and a threat to the safety of Magnolia Estates residents. The petition described me as a transient individual with a history of violence, attempting to perpetrate a land fraud scheme against innocent homeowners. A history of violence, lady? The only things I'd ever fought were roughnecks who couldn't hold their liquor and North Sea storms that tried to sink my rig. But Vivian wasn't just waving legal papers around. She was working the neighborhood like a politician at a barbecue. Emergency HOA meetings. Printed flyers warning residents about the dangerous con artist targeting their community. She even started a WhatsApp group called Protect Magnolia Estates, sharing my license plate number and telling people to call 911 if they saw me. The buzz of 120 households melting down at once sounded like angry bees trapped in a mason jar. Meanwhile, her husband Bradley fast-tracked a retroactive zoning variance through the county commission, backdated permits, emergency approval for the subdivision that had somehow been accidentally delayed in processing. The man was rewriting history faster than Stylin's propaganda department. I, on the other hand, did what oil rig workers do best: methodical problem-solving under pressure. I hired Jenkins Land Surveying, the most respected firm in 3 counties. Cost me $2,000, but when you're fighting for 40 acres worth millions, you don't skimp on ammunition. Their GPS equipment confirmed what I already knew: every house, every street, every blade of artificially green grass sat squarely on Kowalski family land. Then things got interesting. The original developer, Pinnacle Construction, had filed their permits using a property description that didn't match any existing survey. They had literally made up coordinates and submitted them to the county. And guess who was listed as Pinnacle's legal counsel on the incorporation papers? Vivian Blackwood, Esquire. This woman hadn't just moved into a house built on stolen land, she'd helped steal it. Mini twist: Vivian's restraining order required her to prove legal standing to file it. That meant proving she actually owned the property she was trying to protect. When the judge asked for her title documentation, she couldn't produce any. Here's a nugget for you: adverse possession laws don't apply to property with active tax payments. I had been paying taxes on this land for 5 years straight, even while working overseas. Takeaway: always check who's actually paying property taxes before assuming ownership. The judge gave her 30 days to produce clear title and granted me the right to post signs on my property during the investigation. I didn't post boring "no trespassing" signs. I went bigger. Spent $300 at the local print shop for vinyl banners. Big ones. Welcome to Kowalski land. Family owned since 1943. Each included a QR code linking to public records proving my ownership. I strung them up on fence posts throughout the development like Christmas decorations. The creak of old fence posts bearing the weight of truth sounded sweeter than church bells. But I wasn't done. If these people wanted to live on my land, they could pay rent, $50 per day, per household. I posted notices on every door explaining the temporary trespassing fee while ownership was being determined, and included my Venmo account for convenient payment. The neighborhood exploded. Property values dropped faster than a lead balloon. Real estate agents started warning clients away from Magnolia Estates. The Protect Magnolia Estates WhatsApp group devolved into a digital civil war, residents blaming Vivian for the mess, others wanting to lynch me. Some folks even tried to pay the $50 fee. Figured it was cheaper than hiring lawyers. That's when I knew I had them. Vivian's next move was predictable. She tried to rally the troops, calling another emergency meeting, renting the VFW hall when the clubhouse got too crowded. Standing in front of 200 panicked homeowners, she promised to destroy the outsider threatening their way of life. The acrid smell of stress sweat in that packed hall could peel paint. But here's what she didn't know: I had been recording everything. Every threat, every lie, every admission that she knew the development was built on questionable land. My phone had been running continuously since our first conversation. When she stood up at that meeting and said, "We all know these people target hardworking families who've invested their life savings," she just handed me evidence of discriminatory intent. Maritime law teaches you to document everything because international contracts can hinge on a single recorded conversation. The sound of car doors slamming as residents rushed home to research property fraud lawyers was music to my ears. Vivian's next tactic came straight from the dirty politics playbook: if you can't win on facts, destroy your opponent's credibility. She hired Apex Investigations, a private detective agency specializing in family court background research. Translation: dig up dirt on divorced dads and deadbeat spouses. Their mission was simple: find anything to make me look like an unfit property owner. When that failed, turns out 15 years of clean maritime employment records and Navy veteran status don't scream dangerous criminal. She escalated. She filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent, claiming my obsession with fraudulent property claims indicated severe psychological disturbance requiring state intervention. The woman was actually trying to have me committed so she could steal my land legally. But Vivian made one critical mistake. She underestimated small-town networks. Martha Sandoval had worked as county clerk for 38 years before retiring. She knew every skeleton in the closet, which politicians owed favors to whom, and exactly how much Bradley Blackwood's consulting fees had increased since joining the county commission. Martha also happened to be my grandmother's bridge partner and the only person Babsia trusted with her famous pierogi recipe. The smell of fresh coffee and old secrets filled Martha's kitchen as she laid out the real story. The Blackwood boy received $2 million from Pinnacle Construction, she said, sliding photocopied bank statements across her kitchen table. They called it a feasibility study fee for county development planning. Funny thing about feasibility studies, they usually happen before you build 120 houses, not after. Martha had kept copies of everything. County Commission meeting minutes showing Bradley knew about my ownership, environmental impact studies that had been falsified, backdated building permits to cover the illegal construction, and the crown jewel, recorded phone calls between Vivian and Pinnacle executives plotting the acquisition of my property. Mini twist: my 15 years working international oil rigs had given me more than a solid savings account. Maritime law requires mastering complex property rights, international contracts, and dispute resolution. I wasn't just some blue-collar guy they could intimidate. I was certified in handling multimillion-dollar legal disputes across multiple jurisdictions. More importantly, I had connections. Forensic accountants who specialized in tracing money through offshore drilling companies. Lawyers who knew RICO statutes inside and out. People whose careers revolved around untangling international fraud schemes. Here's your knowledge nugget. RICO laws apply to property fraud when multiple parties conspire across state or county lines. Takeaway: document everything when dealing with suspected corruption. Patterns matter more than individual incidents. I filed federal RICO charges against Vivian, Bradley, and Pinnacle Construction, alleging criminal conspiracy to defraud a property owner, and requested immediate asset freezes for all defendants pending investigation. Just for fun, I simultaneously filed adverse possession claims against all HOA common areas, the pool, clubhouse, and playgrounds they had built on my land. The rumble of news vans arriving at Magnolia Estates sounded like distant thunder. Vivian's panic response was spectacular. She tried to flee to her sister's house in Sarasota, only to be pulled over at the Georgia-Florida border with suitcases full of financial documents and $40,000 in cash. Bradley attempted to resign from the county commission for health reasons, but federal subpoenas arrived before he could submit paperwork. Pinnacle Construction suddenly declared bankruptcy, though their executives had managed to transfer all assets to a new company, Magnolia Development, LLC, the week before. That's when the HOA board made their fatal mistake. They levied an emergency assessment of $15,000 per household to fund their legal defense against my frivolous lawsuit. Imagine coming home from work to find a letter demanding $15,000 to fight a lawsuit that exists because your HOA president helped steal the land your house sits on. The residents' revolt was swift and merciless. A taste of metal from stress-grinding teeth became the neighborhood's unofficial flavor. Two factions emerged: Team FAD, who wanted Vivian's head on a pike, and Team Fight the Claim, who viewed me as an outsider threatening their American dream. The neighborhood Facebook group became a digital battlefield. Real estate agents fled like rats from a sinking ship. Property showings dropped to zero. But the most beautiful part: some residents started doing their own research. Turns out, when you buy a house, you're supposed to get something called a clear title. About 60 families discovered their title insurance specifically excluded coverage for fraud by the seller. The chemical smell of photocopying machines working overtime drifted from every real estate office in town as lawyers scrambled to understand how an entire subdivision had been built without anyone actually owning the land. Local news picked up the story when Martha leaked the financial documents to her nephew at WGST. County Commissioner Bradley Blackwood's millions in questionable consulting fees made excellent Friday night ratings. Desperation makes people stupid, and Vivian Blackwood was about to prove that theory in spectacular fashion. Her first offer came through a lawyer, $500,000 cash, immediate settlement, full confidentiality agreement. I laughed and hung up. When that failed, she tried a different approach. If she couldn't buy me off, she'd frame me. Amateur hour. Her 22-year-old son Derek, a trust fund kid with a criminal justice degree and delusions of cleverness, spray-painted thigh beef across my grandmother's barn at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Problem was, I had installed military-grade security cameras throughout the property after the first vandalism attempt. Watching Derek stumble around in the dark with a can of Cryan Red, occasionally checking his phone for directions to the barn, was better entertainment than Netflix. Vivian wasn't satisfied with petty vandalism. She escalated to planting evidence. Derek dumped stolen HOA equipment, pool maintenance gear, landscaping tools, even a riding mower, on my property, then called the sheriff to report the theft. The mechanical hum of my security cameras tracking their movements sounded like a cat purring. Police Chief Ronald Hutchkins arrived with all the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be fishing. Turned out he was Bradley Blackwood's golf buddy and regular poker partner. The investigation consisted of Chief Hutchkins glancing at the planted evidence, shaking his head sadly, and explaining that he'd have to arrest me unless I cooperated with the HOA's reasonable requests. I handed Chief Hutchkins a USB drive containing 48 hours of security footage showing Derek's crimes in glorious 4K resolution. "Chief," I said, "either arrest that boy for trespassing, vandalism, and evidence tampering, or explain to the FBI why you're covering for him." The taste of adrenaline during our midnight stakeouts was bitter as black coffee, but worth every sleepless hour. Mini twist. While researching the property deed for my lawsuit, I discovered something that changed everything. My grandmother's original deed included mineral rights to the property, and according to recent geological surveys filed with the state, my 40 acres sat on confirmed natural gas deposits worth more than $50 million. Suddenly, Pinnacle Construction's aggressive interest in this worthless farmland made perfect sense. But here's where it got really interesting. Digging through Bradley Blackwood's financial records, now public thanks to the federal investigation, I found a 99-year gas lease agreement signed in my name with a forged signature, authorizing extraction on my property for the next century. Here's your nugget. Mineral rights often stay with the original property owner unless explicitly sold separately. Takeaway. Always check what subsurface rights come with your property deed. They might be worth more than the house itself. The energy company had already paid $10 million in advance royalties, laundered through Bradley's consulting firm and Vivian's law practice. The lease included pipeline easements affecting every single house in Magnolia Estates, meaning property values would crater once industrial extraction began. I contacted Meridian Energy directly, explained that $10 million lease had been signed by someone who didn't own the mineral rights, and offered them a choice: void the fraudulent contract and negotiate with the actual property owner, or watch their investment vanish in federal court. The tension in their corporate office conference room was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. 3 days later, I had a new contract, 50% royalties, a $20 million signing bonus, and full environmental oversight of any extraction operations. Plus, Meridian's legal team would support my property claim as part of protecting their legitimate business interests. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded when residents learned about the gas lease. Half blamed me for industrializing their community. The other half blamed Vivian for signing away their property values without their knowledge. Children were forbidden from playing in certain yards as parents chose sides in the escalating civil war. But the sweetest moment came when Vivian tried one last desperate play. She organized a community safety meeting at the clubhouse built on my property, remember, and invited the entire neighborhood to discuss protecting our families from outside threats. 200 angry homeowners packed into the room. Vivian stood at the front, perfectly coiffed and confident, ready to rally the troops against the dangerous outsider. That's when I walked in and handed her an eviction notice. "Mrs. Blackwood," I announced to the stunned crowd, "you're trespassing on private property. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The scratch of pens on paper as residents frantically took notes sounded like mice in the walls. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Half the crowd demanded Vivian's resignation. The other half shouted threats at me. Someone called the sheriff. Someone else called the news. But the most beautiful sound of all was Vivian's voice cracking as she tried, and failed, to maintain control over a situation that had completely escaped her grasp. The smoking gun came from the most unlikely source, Martha Sandoval's basement filing cabinet. I kept copies of everything, Martha explained, leading me down creaky wooden steps into her cluttered basement. 38 years as a county clerk teaches you that politicians have selective memory problems. The musty smell of old documents and mousetraps filled the air as she opened a metal filing cabinet labeled insurance files. Do not discard. Inside were photocopies of meeting minutes, financial records, and recorded transcripts that were supposedly destroyed in a county office water leak 3 months earlier. The first bombshell, Bradley Blackwood hadn't just known about my property ownership. He had attended a closed-door county commission meeting where they specifically discussed how to resolve the Kolsky problem. The meeting minutes, in Martha's meticulous handwriting, showed commissioners debating eminent domain alternatives and editing the development approval process. Vivian had been there too, not as a resident, but as Pinnacle Construction's legal counsel. This meeting happened 6 months before the first house was built, 18 months before she moved into the neighborhood. She had been planning this theft from the beginning. But the real revelation was bigger than my property. Martha's files contained evidence of similar schemes across 12 rural communities in Georgia, the same pattern, targeting absent military families, overseas workers, or elderly landowners, using shell companies to build developments on disputed land, corrupting local officials to provide retroactive approvals, and then painting the original owners as troublemakers trying to steal homes from innocent families. Vivian's law firm hadn't just specialized in clearing problematic titles. They had pioneered a systematic method for stealing rural property. They called it productive land use optimization, which sounded much better than organized theft in their marketing materials. The financial web was staggering. HOA fees throughout the affected communities had been artificially inflated to funnel money into Bradley's campaign fund. County building inspectors, planning commissioners, and even some judges had received consulting fees from the development companies. The total fraud exceeded $100 million across multiple counties. But here's what hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My grandmother's original deed contained a covenant I had never noticed. The land was to be used for the benefit of the community and its children. Babsia had included that clause because she remembered the Depression, when neighbors helped neighbors survive. The weight of that revelation settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about recovering my property anymore. It was about honoring my grandmother's vision while stopping these parasites from destroying other families. The mineral lease money could fund something meaningful. Scholarships, community programs, maybe even affordable housing for working families. Martha's final surprise was the most dangerous. Recorded phone calls between Vivian and federal energy regulators showed she'd been trying to expedite pipeline approval by claiming she represented affected landowners who supported the project. The recordings proved she had been impersonating me in conversations with federal agencies, a federal felony, multiple federal felonies. The warm feeling of purpose replacing cold anger was like stepping from winter into spring sunlight. I called my cousin Tommy at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, an investigative journalist with a nose for corruption and a personal grudge against HOA abuse, and sent him copies of everything Martha had given me. "Thad," he said after reviewing the files, "this isn't just about your property. This is the biggest rural property theft scheme in Georgia history. We're talking Pulitzer Prize territory." Within hours, federal investigators were already building cases against the entire conspiracy. My RICO lawsuit had become key evidence in a multi-state investigation. Vivian and Bradley weren't just facing civil liability, they were looking at decades in federal prison. The sound of wind through the cemetery trees during my visit to Babsia's grave seemed to whisper approval. Building a team to take down a criminal conspiracy is like assembling a crew for an offshore drilling operation. You need specialists who can handle pressure and won't crack when things get dangerous. Martha Sandoval became my intelligence officer. 38 years of county records were stored in her memory like a human filing system. She knew which officials took bribes, which judges played golf with developers, and exactly how much money had changed hands in backroom deals. Jake Morrison was my forensic accountant, recommended by a petroleum engineer I'd worked with in the Gulf. Jake specialized in following money through shell companies, offshore accounts, and the kind of creative bookkeeping that made Enron look amateur. The scratch of his calculator and the buzz of multiple computer screens running financial analysis software became the soundtrack of our war room. Rebecca Chin, an environmental lawyer with 15 years of experience fighting energy companies, joined when she learned about the fraudulent gas lease. She had spent her career untangling exactly this kind of corporate government corruption. Her specialty was forcing disclosure of environmental impact studies and catching regulators who rubber-stamped dangerous projects. Tommy Kowalski, my journalist cousin, became our media strategist. While the feds built their criminal case, Tommy crafted a narrative exposing the pattern of rural property theft to the entire country. His investigation would run in 3 parts: the conspiracy, the victims, and the cover-up. Our legal strategy was multi-pronged warfare: federal RICO charges to invoke treble damages, state fraud charges to pierce corporate veils, environmental lawsuits to halt pipeline construction, and asset seizure petitions to freeze every bank account the conspirators touched. The smell of Chinese takeout and stale coffee filled my grandmother's kitchen as we worked 18-hour days mapping the conspiracy. Jake's financial audit revealed the scope of the theft. Vivens' law firm had received $12 million in consulting fees from development companies. Bradley's campaign fund had been artificially inflated by HOA fee diversions from 8 communities. Even the county assessor had received monthly payments disguised as property evaluation services. Knowledge nugget time. Title insurance doesn't protect against fraud by a seller who never actually owned the property. Takeaway: always verify property ownership through multiple sources, not just title companies. Becca's environmental strategy was brilliant. She demanded full disclosure of all environmental impact studies for the gas extraction project. Meridian Energy couldn't produce legitimate studies because Vivin had submitted falsified documents. The entire project faced federal shutdown. But my favorite part was the energy company gambit. I contacted 3 competing gas companies and told them Meridian's lease was fraudulent. Suddenly, there was a bidding war for legitimate mineral rights to property worth $50 million in natural gas deposits. Competition is beautiful. Meridian's original offer of $20 million became $40 million when ExxonMobil entered the bidding. Then Shell offered $60 million plus environmental cleanup guarantees. By the time the dust settled, I had an $80 million deal that included community benefit agreements, environmental monitoring, and cleanup bonds. The click of computer keys as Jake traced financial transactions sounded like rain on a tin roof. Meanwhile, we were building a coalition of victims from the other affected communities. Turns out, when you systematically steal rural property, you create a lot of angry farmers, veterans, and working families. Our victim database included over 300 families across 12 counties. Tommy's investigative series would profile the human cost of the conspiracy: elderly couples losing family farms, military families returning from deployment to find their land developed, and working families bankrupted by legal fees fighting fraudulent evictions. The technical preparation was military precise: professional property surveys with GPS coordinates accurate to 3 inches, title searches going back 150 years to establish a clear ownership chain, environmental assessments supporting the gas lease negotiations, and engineering studies of pipeline routes designed to minimize disruption to existing homes. Our media campaign was set to launch simultaneously with the federal arrests, Tommy's series in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and a social media campaign targeting property fraud awareness. A documentary filmmaker who specialized in corporate corruption stories had already expressed interest in the broader conspiracy. But the most satisfying element was community intelligence gathering. We identified residents in Magnolia Estates who had grown suspicious of Vivian's leadership, documented HOA rule violations by her allies, and gathered evidence of discriminatory enforcement against minority families and single mothers. Here's another knowledge nugget. Mineral rights can be severed from surface rights in most states, meaning you might own your house but not what's underneath it. Check your deed carefully. Subsurface rights might belong to someone else entirely. The final piece was coordination with federal investigators. My evidence became their evidence. Our financial analysis supported their money laundering charges. Our victim interviews provided testimony for their conspiracy case. The buzz of multiple phone conversations coordinating legal strategy filled the farmhouse like electricity before a storm. By the time we were ready to spring our trap, we had federal prosecutors, state investigators, environmental regulators, and national media all working toward the same goal: the complete destruction of a criminal conspiracy that had stolen over $100 million from rural American families. Cornered animals are dangerous, and Vivian Blackwood was about to prove that desperate criminals with political connections can be downright lethal. The accidental fire at the county records building happened on a Thursday night. Conveniently, the only files destroyed were those related to property disputes from the past 5 years. The fire department ruled it an electrical failure, but somehow the sprinkler system had mysteriously malfunctioned in just that one storage room. The acrid smell of smoke and burned paper hung over downtown for 3 days, like evidence cremated in real time. But destroying public records wasn't enough for Vivian. She needed to destroy me personally. Enter Danny Clove, a disgruntled roughneck I had fired from a North Sea rig 2 years earlier for showing up drunk. Suddenly, Danny was giving interviews to local news, claiming I was unstable, violent, and had threatened crew members. The interview was amateur hour. Danny couldn't keep his story straight, forgot which rig we'd supposedly worked on together, and accidentally mentioned that Vivian had paid him $5,000 for his courage in speaking out. The reporters smelled a setup faster than sharks detect blood. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated to physical intimidation. My truck was vandalized 3 times in 1 week, tires slashed, windows broken, and land thief keyed into the paint. The security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned during each incident, except for my backup system, which Vivian didn't know about. The real escalation came when they tried to poison my dog. Rex, a German Shepherd mix I'd adopted from a shelter and trained as a guard dog for the property, narrowly survived. Someone threw antifreeze-laced hamburger meat over my fence. If I hadn't caught Rex before he ate it, they would have motored my dog to send a message. The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth as I collected the poisoned meat for evidence. That's when I called Marcus Webb, a retired Marine Corps security consultant I'd worked with on overseas contracts. Marcus specialized in protecting executives from kidnapping in hostile countries. Protecting one machinist from HOA terrorists was vacation duty for him. Mini-twist time. Marcus recognized the hired thugs immediately. They were off-duty sheriff's deputies from Paulding County, moonlighting for a private security firm owned by Bradley Blackwood's brother-in-law. The corruption network extended across county lines, with law enforcement officers acting as enforcers for the property theft conspiracy. Here's your knowledge nugget. Witness intimidation automatically elevates civil fraud cases to federal felony charges with mandatory minimum sentences. Takeaway: document all harassment. It often leads to much bigger criminal charges than the original crime. The federal interest was immediate and overwhelming. FBI agents opened a RICO investigation into the multi-county conspiracy. My protected witness status meant federal marshals were monitoring my property 24/7. The harassment stopped immediately when word spread that federal agents were involved. But the community fracture was devastating to watch. Magnolia Estates had become an armed camp. Some residents hired private security companies to protect their families from outside threats. Others organized neighborhood watch groups to monitor suspicious activity. Children weren't allowed to play outside after dark. The neighborhood Facebook group had devolved into a digital war zone. Threats, accusations, and paranoid conspiracy theories dominated every discussion. Longtime neighbors stopped speaking to each other. Property showings ceased entirely as real estate agents refused to enter what they called the combat zone. Vivian's panic response was spectacular in its desperation. She attempted to flee the country with hidden offshore accounts containing $2 million in cash. TSA agents found the money in her luggage at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, packed in vacuum-sealed bags inside empty shampoo bottles. The sound of helicopters circling during federal raids became the neighborhood's new background noise. Her husband Bradley collapsed during the FBI raid on their house. Heart attack, according to the ambulance crew, though it looked more like a panic attack when agents started reading him his rights. Bradley's medical emergency didn't stop the search warrant execution. Federal agents just worked around the paramedics. Pinnacle Construction executives started plea negotiations the moment their bank accounts were frozen. Amazing how quickly corporate loyalty evaporates when people face 20-year prison sentences. They were offering testimony against Vivian and Bradley in exchange for reduced charges. The most beautiful sound was Vivian's voice on the wiretapped phone calls, becoming more shrill and desperate as her world collapsed. The FBI had been recording her conversations for weeks, capturing detailed confessions about the entire conspiracy. But the ultimate vindication came when the energy company investigation revealed the full scope of the mineral rights fraud. Vivian hadn't just forged my signature on one lease, she'd been forging signatures for dozens of property owners across multiple states. The federal energy fraud charges alone carried a potential life sentence. The crunch of broken glass from vandalized security cameras mixed with the mechanical hum of federal surveillance equipment, creating a symphony of justice in motion. Aspiration had turned Vivian Blackwood into something far more dangerous than a corrupt HOA president. It had turned her into a woman with nothing left to lose. Her final gambit was pure scorched earth. If she couldn't keep the stolen property, she'd destroy it for everyone else. An emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance, a special assessment of $25,000 per household to purchase the entire development from a shell company she'd created overnight. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Transfer all 120 properties to Magnolia Holdings LLC, a company she secretly owned, drain every homeowner's savings through the emergency assessment, then declare the HOA bankrupt, leaving families homeless while she disappeared with millions in extracted equity. But Vivian's desperation made her sloppy. She didn't know about my friendship with Judge Patricia Morrison, Jake's sister, and the federal magistrate handling asset forfeiture in my case. When Vivian tried to execute her property transfer scheme, Judge Morrison issued an immediate restraining order, freezing all real estate transactions in Magnolia Estates. The sabotage escalated beyond property theft into attempted murder. Someone contaminated my well water with industrial chemicals, specifically methylene chloride from a dry cleaning operation. The chemical smell was barely detectable, but lab tests revealed concentrations high enough to cause liver failure within weeks. If I hadn't been paranoid enough to test my water supply, I'd be dead. The arson attempt came next, 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Derek Blackwood and 2 accomplices tried to burn down my grandmother's farmhouse with me inside. They used an accelerant trail from the barn to the house, figuring the old wood would go up like kindling. What they didn't know was that Marcus Webb had installed military-grade motion sensors throughout the property. The alarm system woke me before they lit the first match. My security footage captured everything in infrared. 3 figures pouring gasoline, lighting the trail, then panicking when the fire spread faster than expected. The sound of sirens cutting through the rural Georgia darkness was sweeter than gospel music. Mini-twist time. The FBI sting operation had been running for weeks. Agent Sarah Chen, posing as a corrupt energy company lawyer, had been meeting with Vivian to discuss permanently resolving the ownership problem. Vivian confessed to the entire conspiracy on tape, including her plan to frame me for threatening federal agents. The wire recordings were devastating, Vivian admitting she targeted military families specifically because they were deployed and couldn't defend their property, describing me as just another dumb veteran who doesn't understand how the system works, and planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a state facility. But the most damning evidence was her casual discussion of similar schemes across multiple states. Vivian's operation had stolen rural property worth over $300 million from more than 1,000 families. She kept detailed records of every theft, every forged document, every bribed official. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. Simultaneous raids hit properties in 12 counties. Asset forfeiture wiped out everything Vivian and Bradley owned: houses, cars, bank accounts, even Vivian's jewelry collection. The FBI seized financial records going back 15 years. The community awakening was painful but necessary. Residents finally understood they'd been living in a criminal enterprise disguised as a suburban neighborhood. Their property values weren't just declining, they were living on stolen land with clouded titles that made their homes essentially worthless. The weight of responsibility as the story went national was crushing. Congressional hearings on rural property fraud. Documentary crews, filming the destruction of the American dream. My phone constantly rang with reporters, victims from other states, and lawyers offering to represent more fraud victims. But the most satisfying moment was Vivian's final breakdown. Caught red-handed with evidence of arson, attempted murder, and federal conspiracy charges, she tried one last desperate play, claiming she was the real victim of a federal conspiracy to steal property from hardworking American families. The press conference was spectacular. Vivian, flanked by two public defenders who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, sobbing about government overreach while federal prosecutors read a 4 to 7 count indictment. Wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, attempted murder, arson, and leading a criminal enterprise. These were the charges mounting against Vivian. The flash of camera lights during her appearance illuminated the complete collapse of her carefully constructed facade. Bradley's cooperation came immediately. Faced with the possibility of life in prison, he provided testimony against Vivian, Pinnacle Construction, and 14 county officials across 3 states. His detailed confession revealed the full scope of a corruption network that had infected rural Georgia like cancer. The chemical smell of document preservation spray filled the federal evidence warehouse as investigators cataloged thousands of fraudulent documents. Every forged signature, falsified permit, and bribed approval was preserved for what prosecutors called the largest rural property fraud case in American history. But through it all, the most beautiful sound was silence. The absence of Vivian's voice, her threats, lies, and attempts to destroy my family's legacy was almost euphoric. The county courthouse hadn't seen crowds like this since the civil rights protests of the 1960s. 600 people packed a building designed for half that number, with overflow crowds watching on big screens set up in the parking lot. News vans from Atlanta, Jacksonville, and Nashville lined the streets. Federal marshals maintained security as the biggest corruption trial in Georgia history reached its climax. Vivian Blackwood arrived in handcuffs but had been released on $1 million bond pending trial. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the hollow look in her eyes or the tremor in her hands. Bradley sat separately, having already pled guilty and agreed to testify against his wife in exchange for a reduced sentence. The buzz of hundreds of conversations created a noise like angry wasps as residents, media, and federal investigators filled every available seat. Judge Patricia Morrison called for order as the Emergency County Commission meeting began. The official agenda was simple: vote on whether to void all fraudulent development approvals and return stolen property to the rightful owners. The real agenda was public accountability for 15 years of systemic corruption. Commissioner Williams, who had somehow avoided the FBI dragnet, called the first witness. Vivian stood at the podium, defiant despite the federal charges hanging over her head. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "I stand before you as a victim of federal overreach and a conspiracy to destroy our community. For years, I've worked tirelessly to build Magnolia Estates into a model neighborhood where families could pursue the American dream." The crowd stayed restlessly. Someone in the back shouted, "What about the families you stole from?" Vivian's composure slipped. "I never stole anything," she insisted. "Every development was properly approved through legitimate county processes. If there were paperwork irregularities, they were the result of county incompetence, not criminal intent." Then she pointed directly at me, sitting in the front row with my legal team. "This man, this outsider, is destroying the lives of 120 innocent families because he wants to profit from a legal technicality. He's trying to steal homes from hardworking Americans." The metallic taste of controlled anger filled my mouth as she continued her lies. As members of the community listened, Vivian's voice rose to evangelical fervor. "We cannot allow government agents and outside agitators to destroy what we've built together. These people target successful communities because they hate seeing ordinary Americans prosper." That's when Agent Sarah Chen stood from her seat in the gallery, the same FBI agent who had been posing as a corrupt lawyer to gather evidence against Vivian. "Your Honor," Agent Chen announced, "I'd like to present evidence directly relevant to Mrs. Blackwood's testimony." The courtroom fell silent as Agent Chen activated a portable speaker. Vivian's own voice filled the room, crystal clear from the wire recordings. "Those people are always deployed and can't defend their property. Military families, overseas workers, they are perfect targets because by the time they discover what happened, we've already sold half the lots." Vivian's face went white as the words condemned her. The recording continued. "That Kowalski veteran thinks he can threaten our operation. I've destroyed bigger men than him. We'll have him declared mentally incompetent and committed to a state facility. Problem solved." The crowd erupted. Shouts of rage, calls for justice, The sound of 600 people realizing they'd been living atop a criminal enterprise. Federal marshals moved quickly to maintain order, but the damage was irreversible. Vivian's public facade had completely shattered. That's when I stood and walked to the podium. The room quieted as I faced the community built on my stolen land. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, my voice carrying clearly, "you called me an outsider, but my family has owned this land for 80 years. My grandmother grew vegetables on this soil during the Depression to feed her neighbors for free. She included a covenant in the original deed requiring that this land benefit the entire community." I turned to the crowd. "You are not my enemies. You are victims of the same criminal conspiracy that targeted my family. Vivian Blackwood didn't just steal my property, she stole your security, your property values, and your trust in the American dream." The flash of cameras captured every word as I delivered my prepared statement. "Today, I am announcing the creation of the Babsha Kowalski Community Trust, funded by mineral rights settlements, $80 million for scholarships, affordable housing, and community development. Because my grandmother always said land should help families build better lives, not destroy them." The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Even some of Vivian's former allies were clapping. As the truth finally sank in, Commissioner Williams called for the vote, unanimous approval to void all fraudulent permits and return property to legitimate ownership, unanimous approval for criminal referrals to federal prosecutors, unanimous approval for Vivian Blackwood's immediate removal from all county positions. Federal marshals escorted a sobbing Vivian from the courthouse. Her final words, captured by every camera, were a hollow threat. "This isn't over. You'll regret destroying me." But it was over. The MIC had been dropped, and justice had been served. 6 months later, I stood in what used to be my grandmother's vegetable garden, watching kids play on swings funded by mineral rights money that criminals had tried to steal. The laughter of children where Babsha once grew her prize-winning tomatoes felt like the universe coming full circle. Vivian Blackwood received 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Her husband, Bradley, got 10 years and $50 million in restitution after fully cooperating with prosecutors. 14 county officials across 3 states faced federal charges, and the FBI expanded its investigation into 12 other states where similar schemes had been operating. Pinnacle construction executives flipped faster than pancakes at a church breakfast, providing evidence that led to the conviction of the entire criminal network. Their testimony revealed over $300 million in stolen rural property across the Southeast. But the real victory was in prison sentences. It was what we built from the ashes of corruption. The Babsha Kowalski Community Trust started with $80 million from the mineral rights settlement but grew to over $120 million when competing energy companies bid for extraction rights. The trust operates under strict environmental guidelines, with community oversight and guaranteed cleanup bonds. Every family in Magnolia Estates received clear title to their property at no cost. The trust paid all legal fees, title searches, and property tax adjustments. Nobody lost their home because of Vivian's crimes. In fact, property values stabilized once the legal cloud lifted and the Community Development Fund was established. The scholarship program has already changed lives. Emma Rodriguez, whose single mother cleaned houses to afford their mortgage, received a full ride to Georgia Tech for engineering. Marcus Thompson, son of a deployed Army sergeant, got into Emory Pre-Med with all expenses covered. 68 kids in the first year alone, with priority given to children of military families and working-class parents. The annual Babsha Kowalski Community Festival takes place every September on the anniversary of her birth. Last year, over 3,000 people attended. We serve parajai made from her original recipe, host live music on a stage built where the old barn once stood, and present scholarships to local students. Even some of Vivian's former supporters volunteer at the food booths now. The community center, built on land I donated adjacent to the subdivision, hosts everything from voter registration drives to senior citizen meals. The smell of fresh coffee and friendly conversation fills the building most mornings as neighbors who once glared across property lines now work together on community projects. But my favorite part is the community garden, 40 raised beds where residents grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Martha Sandy Val, now 81, teaches traditional canning methods to young mothers. Kids learn where food comes from and families who couldn't afford fresh produce now have garden plots that feed them year-round. The Environmental Monitoring Program ensures gas extraction operations meet the highest safety standards. Community representatives inspect every pipeline, monitor air and water quality, and have veto power over any operations that threaten public health. Energy companies initially resisted oversight but discovered that community support actually made their operations more efficient. Tommy's investigative series won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing rural property fraud schemes nationwide. His documentary, Stolen Land, The American Dream Hijacked, led to congressional hearings and new federal protections for overseas workers and military families, sparking similar investigations in 15 other states. I live in the renovated farmhouse now, surrounded by a community that understands the difference between neighbors and predators. The taste of well water that runs clear and sweet reminds me daily that some victories are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. The texture of rich Georgia soil between my fingers as I plant Bob's heirloom tomatoes connects me to 3 generations of family history. But it's the sound of children playing safely in their yards that tells me we've honored her memory properly. Here's your call to action. If you faced HOA corruption, property fraud, or powerful people trying to steal what your family worked for, share your story in the comments. Your experience might help someone else avoid the same trap. And remember, check your deeds, know your rights, and never let anyone tell you that working people can't fight City Hall and win. Sometimes, when you refuse to give up, the little guy really does win, and your grandmother's land might be worth more than you think.